Ever had one of those software updates go completely sideways?
Oh, tell me about it.
Like, your phone restarts and the font's so big you can barely read anything. Or like your favorite app just totally forgets how to, like, send a file.
Yeah.
It's like in those moments, you really start to appreciate, like, a well-managed software release,
You're
right?
telling me. I had this happen once, right before a road trip.
Oh.
My navigation app decided to update.
No.
And, well, it basically decided that every single road was a one-way street.
Oh, no.
Not exactly ideal when you're trying to, navigate across the country.
That's brutal.
Yeah.
So today, we're doing a deep dive into the whole world of software releases, versions, and tags. It's kind of like this behind-the-scenes look at how these software teams, how they try to avoid, you know, unleashing those update nightmares on the rest of us.
Right.
So we've got this great article by Ishara Amarasekera, who's a software engineer. It's called Software Releases, Versions, and Tags for Effective Workflow.
Okay.
And, I know what you might be thinking, right? Software releases. That sounds a little techie for me. But honestly, this stuff is relevant even if you've never, written a line of code in your life.
I think so, too.
It's all about, like, how you organize information, how you communicate clearly, making sure everybody's on the same page.
Exactly. Imagine you're, like, trying to work on a project, right?
Yeah.
But everybody's got a different version of the same document.
Oh, yeah.
Total chaos.
Yeah.
And this system is all about, like, bringing order to that chaos.
Right.
Whether it's code, design files, or even just like a shared recipe you have, for your sourdough bread or something.
Ooh, that's a great analogy.
Right.
So, okay, let's unpack this a little bit. So Ishara starts by breaking down these core concepts, right? Releases, versions, and tags.
Yeah.
And you can kind of think of it like labeling different versions of a book, but, for software.
Okay, yeah.
So you've got your major releases. That's like a brand new edition with, like, big changes.
Right.
And then you've got your minor updates, like fixing a typo or adding, like, a new recipe.
Okay.
And then finally there's tags, which are kind of like bookmarks, right?
Yeah.
Marking those really specific points in a project's history.
Makes sense.
So then Ishara dives into this thing called semantic versioning.
Okay.
And I know it sounds kind of intimidating.
That does sound a little scary.
It does. But it's actually a surprisingly intuitive way of numbering software versions. You've seen those, like, strings of numbers like 1.2.3 everywhere.
Right. Yeah.
That's it.
I always wondered about those.
So, and it's not just about, being organized, right?
Mm-hmm.
Semantic versioning helps developers, like, really quickly understand the scope of the changes in a new release.
Uh-huh.
So that 1.2.3, that tells you if it's, a major overhaul or just like a minor tweak.
Okay.
Or even just like some bug fixes. Right. So that first number, the major version, that only changes when there's, like, a really big fundamental shift.
Right.
Like, think of it like going from the first edition of a book to, like, a totally revised second edition.
Okay.
Then you get the second number, the minor version, and that one gets bumped up when, you're adding new features, but they're still compatible with that previous version.
Okay.
So it's like adding a new chapter to your book.
Right. Yeah.
It's fresh content, but it doesn't, make the previous chapters obsolete.
Makes sense. Yeah.
Exactly. And then lastly, there's that third number, the patch. And that's for, the little but important bug fixes.
Right. Right.
Like issuing a corrected printing of your book, because you found a typo.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. What I think is really cool about this is, like, this whole system, it goes way beyond just software.
Right.
It's about signaling the scale of changes in a way that's really clear and consistent.
Right.
And that's important whether you're dealing with code, books, even car models.
It's all about making sure that, like, everyone is speaking the same language.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, now let's talk about these tags for a second, because I think they're really cool.
Okay.
Ishara describes them as, like, these milestones in your project's history.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of like you're taking a snapshot of your code at a particular moment in time.
Right. Like a snapshot. Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. So it's like having that safety net, right?
Yeah.
Like, just in case something goes wrong, you can always kind of go back.
Yeah.
But it's more than just a safety net, though, right?
Yeah.
You were saying earlier that tags, like, they can be used for documentation.
Right.
What did you mean by that?
So think about it this way. Like, code, it isn't just about, like, the code itself.
Right.
It's about the thinking that went into it.
Yeah.
Like, why did they make certain decisions? What problems were they trying to solve?
Right.
And tags, along with, clear documentation, they provide that context.
Okay.
They're like leaving a trail of breadcrumbs, you know?
Right.
So you can go back and understand, like, the why behind the what.
That's a really good point.
Mm-hmm.
See, I'm starting to see how this is important. Like, even outside of software development,
Yeah.
I can't tell you how many times I've been working on a document and, like, wished that I could just go back to a previous version.
Oh, all the time.
Yeah.
And I think that's like what's so important about this article. It takes this process that seems like really technical, right?
Yeah.
But it's actually based on like some really fundamental principles
Yeah.
of organization, communication that really apply to anything.
That's true. Yeah.
Like any project, think about it. You're working on a presentation, a design, planning an event, anything.
Oh, yeah.
Having a clear system for like version control,
Right.
game changer.
Huge.
All right.
I've definitely had my share of, like, version control fails
Oh,
in the past.
yeah.
Scrambling to find the latest version of something.
Yeah.
Or like accidentally emailing the wrong, like,
The worst.
the outdated draft.
Yep.
Ugh, the worst.
Happens all the time.
It does. It's so easy for that stuff to happen.
But if you take some of the principles from this article, like even just using clear names for the different versions, right?
Right.
Documenting your changes, like maybe even use a version control system.
Right.
It can save you so many headaches.
That's a good point. So how would someone, like, practically go about, like, implementing these ideas? Like, does Yashara walk us through that?
He does.
Okay.
Yeah, he walks us through creating releases and tags.
Right.
And it's actually way more straightforward than you'd think.
Okay, good.
It all starts with something called committing your changes,
Okay.
which in like non-technical terms just means like save your work.
Okay, so you're basically taking a snapshot.
Exactly. You're taking a snapshot of your project at that like specific moment.
Right, okay.
And then you create a tag, which is like, putting a label on that specific version.
Okay.
And then finally, you push that tag to your remote repository, which is basically like uploading it to the cloud so everyone on your team can access it.
Okay, so it's like that extra step of, like, making it accessible.
Exactly. Making it accessible.
Wait,
Exactly.
so it sounds like communication is, like, a really key part of this whole process.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, Ishara actually really emphasizes that. He's like, it's not enough to just have the system. Everybody's got to know how to use it
Right.
and why it matters.
Right. It's like even the best system in the world, if no one knows how to use it.
It's useless. Exactly.
Exactly. It's useless.
And he also talks about the importance of release notes, which I think is something that, like, a lot of people don't really think about.
Yeah. Tell me more about release notes. Like, what are those?
Okay, so imagine, like, they're, like, mini blog posts
Okay.
for your software updates.
Okay.
So they give you that context about what's different,
Gotcha.
Did you add stuff? Did you fix bugs? Did you update the documentation? Release notes, they tell that story.
Oh.
So people aren't left wondering, like, what's different?
Oh, right. It's like when your phone tells you what's new in the update.
Exactly.
Which, honestly, I always skip over.
I think we all do.
Yeah.
But they can be really helpful if they're well written,
Yeah, that's true.
And speaking of writing, Ishara suggests using a template for these release notes.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
Especially as a project grows. Like,
Oh my gosh.
the changes start to pile up, and it would just keep everything organized and easy to read.
Exactly. So much easier to read, so much easier to understand. And if you connect this back to what we were talking about before with automation, it's like Ishara actually points out that you can automate some of this using different tools like GitHub Actions or GitLab CI/CD.
Oh, wow. So instead of, like, manually creating tags and release notes and all that, you could have a tool that just does it for you.
Exactly.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and he even highlights this one tool called Release Please.
Okay.
And it's a GitHub action that can, get this, analyze code changes, figure out what the version number should be based on semantic versioning,
Wow.
generate release notes, and even create the release on GitHub all automatically.
It's like having a whole team, like, working behind the scenes
I know, it's wild.
24/7. That's really cool. And it makes you think, like, what else in software development could be automated like this in the future?
Right. The possibilities are pretty much endless.
Yeah.
Imagine, like, code that practically writes itself, bugs that are detected and fixed automatically,
Right.
software updates that just happen seamlessly in the background.
Yeah. That sounds kind of amazing, but also a little bit, I don't know.
Little unnerving.
Yeah, a little unnerving. Like, what happens to, like, the human element in all this?
Yeah, it's a good point, right? Like, just because we can automate everything doesn't mean we should.
Exactly.
I think that's where the conversation has to shift from, like, the what of the technology to the how.
It's a good point.
Like, it's up to us to figure out how to use these advancements responsibly.
You're right. It's about finding that balance. So
Uh,
I guess to kind of wrap things up, like, what are some of the key takeaways from today's deep dive that our listeners can apply to their own work,
Yeah.
even if they're, not software developers?
Totally. So I think first and foremost, just think about how you're managing versions of your work right now.
Okay. Yeah.
Whether it's documents, designs, whatever, like having a system for version control will save you a lot of headaches.
Right. For sure.
And don't be afraid to borrow from semantic versioning using those major, minor patch numbers.
Right.
It's simple, but it's really effective.
Yeah. And I think don't underestimate the power of good documentation.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Like explain your thought process, what you changed, why it matters.
You'll thank yourself later.
Exactly. Future you will thank you.
For real.
Yeah.
And honestly, don't shy away from those automation tools.
Yeah, that's a good point.
There's so much out there that can make your life so much easier.
Yeah, you got to work smarter, not harder.
Exactly.
This was a really interesting deep dive, and it really got me thinking about the future of knowledge management in general. Like, as automation takes over more of these technical parts of our work,
Mm.
how do we make sure that, the human element, like the creativity, the critical thinking, how do we make sure that that doesn't get lost?
It's such a good question. And honestly, I don't know if there's like one right answer,
Right.
But maybe it starts with like embracing a more collaborative approach to knowledge, right? Where
Hmm.
we focus on building those systems and tools that make it easier for us to learn from each other, to share our ideas, and to build on each other's work.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. It's definitely something to think about. Well, until next time, everyone, keep those versions organized, keep your documentation clear, and keep your minds open.